to the National Symposium today, Social Work Day 2022. The time is right for social work. The time is always right for social work. And the reason why the time is always right, because social work is the only profession that can sit in every other profession. I don't know if you heard me. Social work is the only profession that can sit in every other profession. And thank you. They have me special up here, so. Right? You all hearing me good, right? No? Right. And the reason why that is so significant, and every single class that I teach on the very first day, whether it is at the University of the Southern Caribbean, UWI or Custard, the very first thing I tell my students, you are entering into a profession that transcends all. And if that doesn't tell you the power that we possess as social workers, then you better wake up. And the pandemic, which I have called the greatest revealer of all times, told us, smack dab from day one, that without social work, the country would have been far worse than where it is today. Yeah. And I say that because in the earlies, I remember I sat on a committee, one of the very first committee put together by the Honorable Prime Minister, to deal with the social ills or the social fallout of the pandemic, one of the very first committees. And the conversation there was, how can we get to people as quickly as we can so that the fallout will be mitigated? And so, Honorable Minister, I thank you for spearheading, because the recognition that not only we needed to get to the vulnerable and not so vulnerable, because what the pandemic did, it pushed the vulnerable over the precipice and the not so vulnerable holding on by a fingernail. And we social workers through the ministry had to go out there, COVID or no COVID, to get the job done. And I thank you for that. The time is right for social work, and my area is a change in paradigm in social work. And I think my vice president coined it best when she spoke about the change, more so even online, where we are now seeing clients online, assessments online. We have to now talk about the ethics of online and all these different things. It tells us that social work in its current form is moving. Over the last 10 years, we have moved leaps and bounds. But where are we as a country? Where are we as a people, as a social worker? My concern has always been working in the system. So many social workers graduate every year from associate level, bachelor level, and master level, but are not seeing the social workers the way the social workers should be seen. So it speaks to where we are, and what we do. Now, I will not stand here and not speak the truth. We are also responsible for the change that is required. Can you as social workers online and in here say that we have been doing what we need to do to move the profession forward? What I see, what I hear is great individuals, powerful individuals, but weak organizations. I see powerful people doing powerful things in their own corners, but I don't see the bridges that we must cross together. I do not see the buildings that we will build together. And so today, moving forward, and as the president of this association, it gives me great pleasure to speak to the things that we must look forward in moving the paradigm, whereas a profession who can sit in every other profession that we move as one. It starts with Trinidad and Tobago Association of Social Workers. We must be recognized as the association for social workers across the board. And I like the fact that when the ministry called, they called the right people, because there's a recognition there. Thank you, Natalie. But beyond that, it hurts me to sit as the president with so many social workers graduating, but so few registered members. I tell people this, and I make no apologies. People ask, what can we do for them? I said, no. What can we do together? I cannot go to a bookstore and ask for 10% discount. I cannot go to a restaurant and ask for a 5% discount on behalf of social workers if I go in with 20 people. This is going to make no sense. But if I go with 5,000, we might get 20%. So it means that if the paradigm must shift, we as a people must do so together. Are you ready to do your part? Is what I must ask. We must build a profession. Before you come out of law school, you have to register into the law association. Before you leave med school, you have to be as a matter of fact, you can't even practice law without being a member of that association. So as an association, what we have embarked upon and building from the past executive is legislation. We must be legislated, and Minister, we will be coming to you as our spearheader, as our captain of the ship, to take us to Parliament, where we will be asking to be regulated as a profession, where when you want to speak about or with and or around social work, you come to TTSW by law. We as a legislation must be here to license people. Yes, I'm hearing it live. Live. That is the reverberation I'm hearing here this morning. We must build legislation to license so that we can put people where they belong, their profession, their training, and their development. We must license so to be directed by the educators to know what it is we are expected to learn and what it is requiring of us out here. The other area, as we change the paradigm, is practice. One of my angst has always been, and I have discussed this with Dr. Boodram on many occasions, what we learn and teach in school and what we do out in the field. We must bring it together. And so there must be a lot of work if we are to change the paradigm when theory meets practice. Because too often people think that anybody could be a social worker. And that is far from truth. Minister, you warm my heart when you start to talk about the roles of social workers. Say, but look, nobody can do what we do. No one. Psychologist has their role and their responsibility, and we have ours. There are people who are aligned to social work, but they are not social workers. I often say, because you're a nurse and you was in a theater with a doctor for 30 years doing operation, when doctor go on leave, you go on leave too. You're not going to say, well, I was doing this for 30 years so I could be an acting doctor. We must be able to move theory and practice in a way that dignifies what we do. Because this is a science. This is a science with theory. And in order for us to move this paradigm, we must begin to use that. We must begin to look at the theoretical formulation and look at the practical formulation, and we must bring it together. There's a lot for me to discuss today, but be listening for the general meeting of membership come later on this month or early in April, and I expect to see as many thousands as I see here today. So before I go, a call to action. Minister, I will be writing to you because we need a home. We need permanency. The association need permanency. As a profession, we need to be stable. And we recognize your ministry as the standard bearer, holding the most social work and most social systems in the country. And we want to work closely with you to advance all people, not just vulnerable people, but all people. Call to action number 2. We need you to register and to be a member. We need your expertise. We need your guidance. We can't do it alone. And if we want to be recognized and to have our seat at the table and demand it, not by force or by fight, but by sheer experience of who we are, then we need you to be a part of this organization. Minister, I'm going to take a bold step to say that in relation to Social Worker of the Year, I will be speaking to the executive as well and see if we could collaborate on that. So that will be a thing now moving forward, and I'm truly excited by it. And I'm glad that you brought it up first because my executive told me to bring it up here today for you. So I was very happy that you have 10 steps ahead of me in that regard. I love that. I want to say thank you to the people who are indeed on the executive, Madam Vice President and team, Leah for leading this charge. Thank you for answering the call. It is not easy to volunteer when you have a lot going on. And I appreciate that, although I might get frustrated, although I'm miserable-ish sometimes. But I thank you. If we all come together, and I'm excited by the conversation today, if we do what we have to do, and what we have to do may not always be easy, but we live in a society when it becomes hard, we disappear. That is why I appreciate people like Verna, who stand and say what needs to be said, when it needs to be said, and how it needs to be said, even though it may not be pretty. But part of our role as advocates, through a social justice lens, command us to get up and do what we do. So social work is not just giving a food card or going on a home visit, but we have to advocate for people who didn't even know they need advocating. We have to get up and we have to do this. We have to do it through education, through consultation, and through partnership, like we are partnering with this ministry today. So I thank you for allowing me this moment, this space, and this time. And I look forward to the panel discussion as we delineate more and more about social work. I thank you, and may God continue to bless us all.
Thank you very much, Hanif, for that very moving presentation. What I would suggest that can happen is we could drop the salutations. We're all friends here. And we can just go into our presentations. We like to encourage our online participants to post your questions and your comments in the chat. We have a very well-coordinated team from the ministry that will be doing its best to cull your questions so that when the Q&A time comes, they can be posed to the panel and some other panelists that we're going to have some discussions. So now I'm getting confused with all my people because you see I'm writing, I'm making plenty notes. So I think, Verna, you're up next. Yeah, Verna is up next. If I look for the program, I should just leave it open here. Yeah? Great. So up next is one of my favorite people, Verna St. Rose-Greaves. Verna, coming to the podium, or are you staying there?
Oh, honey.
You're staying there?
Safe zone.
Safe zones. She's staying in her safe zone. So you have a title here, Self and the Social Worker. And I know this issue of social justice is something that I know will be a center point of what you will focus on. So it's all yours.
Well, I'm trying to be pretty, Hanif. I'll try to be pretty this morning, so I may not.
You will not misbehave.
I may not venture there.
Okay.
But good morning. Where do I begin? I want to begin with part of what I went through in preparing to come here. I'm 72. I celebrated my 72nd birthday 10 days ago. I feel as if I've worked 172 years, so I don't have to tell all you I'm tired. All protocols being observed, Minister Cox, the permanent secretaries, the association, all you beautiful people, some of my former colleagues, some of them I consider my children, never mind all of them nearly all like me now. But in order for me to come here, and I want to say a special thanks to P.S. Johnson, and she abandoned me, but I understand, who I think was instrumental in convincing me to put in an appearance, because I like my jupa, I hardly come out. Most of my conferences is in the supermarket and the pharmacy. But coming here, and for this week leading up to this, I had to go through a process as I usually do. And you would have heard me say Roberta Flack this morning, Trade Winds Are Blowing, and Simon and Garfunkel. And for the younger ones, Google is all your friend, all you will understand. But social work suffered a loss. And this morning, as I was getting dressed, and I sprayed on my perfume, I thought about her, and I honored her. Nestor Patrick has left the building. And again, to those of you who are younger, Google is your friend. Or find an older social worker and talk about Nestor Patrick. Nestor loved perfumes. She loved the very best in perfumes. And every bottle she possessed, particularly when she traveled abroad, there was a story attached to it. And those stories usually involved some gentleman who saw her and who was so in love with her. They were always wonderful stories. So, Nestor, I honor you, I honor your work, I honor your memory. Thank you for what you have done. Thank you for being one of the few people who believed in me and who understood what I was about. Today I wish that I could sit here and just tell you stories. And out of those stories, there will always be learning. But I can't do that. Because today, I am here as a pusher. There's a drug that I am on, and I have been on from that high. And I want to share that drug with you all. And I want all you to take that drug and run with it. I've pushed it in several areas. I've pushed it in NGOs. I've pushed it where I've worked. I've pushed it in conferences and documents. One of the problems is it's so simple. It's so everyday that people don't see it as important. I worked it up the islands, and like that, people want it. So I come here again today, and I am the pusher. And I want to start the pushing by telling you a story, one that I'm sure you've heard before, because I don't say anything new, you know. I've been saying the same things in different forms, time after time after time. Some people pick it up, some people don't. My father, George Philip Lynch, was a monstration by birth. I think he was the person in my life who I can't describe what he meant and what he continues to mean to me. I was about perhaps age 5. My father would take me and stand me in front of a mirror. I didn't know that there were good mirrors and bad mirrors. We weren't rich people, but my father always ensured that there was a good mirror in the house. And he would stand me in front of that mirror, and he'd stand with me. And he'd say, look at you. Look at yourself. Look at your head. Look at it. They say it's big. Yes, it's big. You know why it's big? Because it's holding the most important thing in your body, your brain, and you have a big brain. And he would go through all aspects of the physical. He'd say, look how you look like me. Because truth be told, I used to be walking Frederick Street and people used to come up to me and say, you're Lynch's daughter. My father worked at TN-Tech. He was a TN-Tech police. And everybody would say, you look like your father. And he would go through the whole thing about why I look like this. And then he would go internally and talk about thinking and your heart and feeling and asking me some critical questions. And when I answered the questions, he would go into those questions and do his own kind of analysis and clarification and guide me a certain way. And that continued for most of my childhood. Even until I became an adult, it changed shape and form, but that kind of schooling, that kind of engagement with myself, that kind of centering me and planting me in terms of a base and belonging, it stayed with me and it will never leave me. But it takes me now to another story. In 2013, it must have been, I had been going through a lot of challenges in terms of social work, in terms of the politics, in terms of all kinds of things. And I distinctly remember, I wonder if I have it, if I could read it, because if I go to explain it, I would take much too long. There was a dear friend of mine who felt very deeply about what I was going through. She was in pain, she was tortured by it. People were saying all kinds of ugly things. I guess I had made some statements that did not sit well with the public and did not sit well with the government of the day. And she was torn and she called me. And she said, Verna, Verna, how do you handle all of this? Where do you go? How do you cope? And she said to me, where do you go inside of you? How is it that people can say all these hurtful things about you, and yet you come up smiling, ready to engage, and it doesn't stop you in your tracks? And I laughed, and I said, I didn't answer her. My answer was clear. It was connected to what my father had done with me, the process that he had put me through. Because what he had done was establish in me my personhood. Who am I? Why am I? Where am I? What are the things that hold me up? While I'm talking here, every one of you here and virtually have an opinion of me, you know. You thinking it? Does that matter? It matters to you. What is important for me in the moment? It is who am I? My character, how I present myself. I am not going to allow an angry public or people out there who do not understand what I'm about to beat me down, to silence me, to throw rocks, and I spend my time catching them. I do what is required. I do what is inside and what I'm directed to do. And I do it without fear. I do it without bowing to anyone. I do it without selling my soul. And for that, I am grateful. And that is what I'm trying to push this morning. And I hope I have buyers, you know. Because over the years, I've developed a program of sort, a structure of sort, knowing self. When P.S. Johnson asked me to present, I was asked to do self-care. And I asked to shift it to self and the social worker. Because I think it's important for us to know self. If we do not know ourselves, we can't take care of it. We can't use it. We can't do anything with it. It is important for us to understand the importance of knowing who we are. So, as we said before, the time was always right for social work. Now is the time for social work to up its game. And I hope that if they bite, that we can use this in a way that will help us to up our game. All right. So let me read a little bit now, because I can talk for the rest of the day on this topic, and I don't want to do that. So I'll read a little bit. My life and my work as a social worker have taught me that knowing self is a critical aspect of personal growth. It is a prerequisite to understanding others and one's environment. It assists us to better unpack the complexities of the human condition. It is the foundation to building a kind of consciousness that is crucial to the elevation of our humanity. Knowing self provides insight into our feelings and thoughts. It throws light on how we feel about important life issues. It helps us to view situations with non-judgmental lenses. A positive sense of self strengthens us to do the work that is required to create the change that we imagine, that we want, and that we need, that Trinidad and Tobago needs. Social work has also taught me that in problem solving, which is at the core of what we do, no matter how well thought out our policies, our procedures, and our practices might be, nothing is more important or effective in implementation than the use of self. But how can we properly or creatively use a self, again, that we do not know and we do not understand? To take care of that self, we must be able to identify what it needs. At the core of our many challenges is a lack of self-awareness. This negatively affects parts of our lives and our transactions, both personal and professional. We have not paid sufficient attention to it as a critical aspect of empowerment. Empowerment has to do with the changing ways in which we think and the transformation of our thinking into action. It assumes that we have to shift our thinking and that self-analysis is an important part of that change. My years of doing social work in different settings have convinced me that this is necessary and needs to be applied. So I believe that we must develop a teaching curriculum and methodology to assist persons in general, but in this instance, social workers in particular, to understand who we are and how to find comfort with who we are and with each other. This curriculum is what I'm pushing today. How do we develop a curriculum? A curriculum that will force us or encourage us to look at who we are, to ask questions of us, to come up with answers to those questions, honest answers to those questions. Now, I have a draft that I have done over the years in terms of how it has to be done. But as I say, because it is so simple, people don't think it's important. But I am convinced it is the key to answering a lot of the challenges that we have in the country. And I want the social workers associations and social workers out there to at least give it some consideration, take it on board, and let's see how we can work through that, how we can develop a curriculum that will force us, that will encourage us, that will perhaps have to drag some of us to honestly look at ourselves, to understand who we are, where we are. I heard Hanif talk about the power of the profession. We will not move to do what we can do if we do not think that we can do it. We sit and we complain too much. We don't have the resources. We don't have the salaries that we want. We don't have this. We don't have that. But what do we do about it? And I think that going through that process, asking those questions of ourselves, answering them honestly, will give us what we seek and what we need to move us, to remove that fear that we have. It's a lot of fear. To give us the courage. And that is where the self-care comes in. Because many of us struggling for breath, you know. We're screaming and we're crying and we're going down. And when we reach a stage where we want to collapse, then we reach for something and say self-care. The easy things, which are generally, I go home, I cry, I bawl, I watch plenty TV, I listen to music, I do some shopping with money that I don't have, become a salary low. Yes, and I'm going to keep stressing that for you all. You know, I turn around the furniture because I feel that if I shift the furniture, I could shift my vibes. I put up the blackout curtain, but the blackout curtain, no blackout the world, you have to come out and face it again. And we have to get a deeper kind of self-care that connects to what we do. A self-care that is ingrained in the training our students that we're bringing into the academy. How do we prepare them? Yeah? Why are we as social workers so afraid of psychoanalysis and whatever is needed for us as we go through training? We are graduating people who, if we are honest, we should be saying to them with love and with generosity, we appreciate you want to be a part of the profession, but we think that you would do better somewhere else. Yeah? With all the love that we can muster. We work next to people who do awful things. Don't tell me that you're a good social worker and you stand shoulder to shoulder with a social worker who brutalizes children on the job, who does the most horrific things. You do not say anything. When I talk, you find I should not. We cannot afford to do that anymore. So we have the self-care has to be ingrained in the training. We are graduating students who do not know how to deal with hunger, who do not know how to treat with poverty, who do not know how to enter community, who walk in fear when they go into people's community, who do not respect community history and community traditions and poor people. We are dealing with virtual learning. We are dealing with all kinds of things on the internet. And I'm a troll. And I go on the internet. I have a lot of time to do that. And I track social workers. And when I see some of the things, I accept it from ordinary people, you know, because well, you're not ordinary, we're extraordinary. And when I see the comments that some of us as social workers write, it breaks my heart. And I often ask, is it that we think that our clients are not on the internet? How can you help people that you do not like? How can you help people that you do not respect? How can it be that there's a shutdown during COVID? The Prime Minister announces the closure of schools. Poor women, daily paid women, who if they miss a day work, they can't buy food, they lose salary. They ask of the Prime Minister, what are we to do with our children? And social workers say, what happened to them? They feel they make them children for the Prime Minister. What? Find some way to look after all the children. What do they expect the Prime Minister to do? Social workers. And at times like these, I'm glad that I don't leave my house, because it means I'll have to meet them and be pretty, as Hanif said. And it's difficult sometimes, but I continue. So we have to do things in ways that doesn't depend on taking care of self after the fact. It's like We grab these candles, scented candles, we burn the bush and the incense in the house, we listen to all the music. It's almost as if we're grabbing for a flotation device on a ship that is going down. I ain't going down on that ship at all, yeah. So let us work to put the self-care inside of everything we do from beginning to end. The training, the practicum, the way we do the training. We cannot continue to send social workers, young, bright, creative people into malfunctioning institutions without proper supervision to be trained. What do you think will happen? If you put your foot into a stinking gym boots and you pull it out, what do you think will happen? Yeah? Our problems lie in our communities. I challenge you all to put the training, the practicum in the community. Send social workers into the communities.
Okay, well, I'm going to interject because I know we have a chance to have a little more interaction.
Oh, I went over my time, as I told you.
Plenty time too.
That is why I was trying to read. So, maybe, as I said, I have the curriculum of sorts. It's a draft, it's a sketch in terms of getting people into knowing self, asking the questions, answering them honestly. I think the problem is the people who must conduct it, because it's a hands-on work that has to be done, have to be specially trained, and I think people are afraid of that. So I'm pushing for us to start that work. I like action. There's a curriculum to be developed, to be tested, and to be worked through and to be applied, not just to the public, but certainly to ourselves first, and then to the public wherever we can do it. I give thanks to you for having me. I give thanks for you listening to me, and I trust that the work will go forward. We can discuss this further in the deliberations. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Verna. And yeah, I was supposed to stop her before, but I think that I really would have done a serious injustice to do that, so we'll make the time up otherwise. And I also want to thank you, because I made a big, bold note, and I got up to the podium, and I forgot to do it, to say that we must recognize Nesta Patrick, you know, and her passing, she batted a good innings, 90, I think.
She 99, she'd have been 100 in August.
She was short, yeah. In fact,
August.
I just had a little communication with Aisha, her daughter, last night. You know, because I remember that going to that house in Mount Lambert, quite a formidable woman.
The saga girl of social work.
So, saga girl of social work. And certainly, as Verna said, you know, we tend not to know those on whose shoulders we stand. So the fact that you don't know who Nesta Patrick is, just go Google her, University of Google. And she really should be recognized for her immense contribution in social work. All right, so you're talking about education and shifting that paradigm, Verna, which is a good cue for me to invite Dr. Boodram. I'm sure that her talk on education goes beyond educating the social worker, because you're talking about the educational sector as well. But certainly, with the work that you do at the university, it's it's a good cue to invite you to do your presentation now.
Good morning, everyone. And I know that we have all been really edified by the presentations of the panelists. And I want to warmly thank the ministry for allowing me the opportunity to represent the social work unit. I don't see this as a presentation, my presentation, but really a discussion into what the unit, or reflective of what the unit has been discussing for some time. And I have to say that this morning at 3 o'clock, I woke up and I said, I need to do over this presentation. You know, I've been working on this for the past few days. I thought I had this thing neatly wrapped up and packaged, as all good social work educators, I guess, would have done. I had history and the present issue, and then I moved on to talk about what does social work mean for the future. And I've been asked to speak about social work education in the future world. And then at 3 o'clock this morning, I said to myself, that presentation is an academic presentation, and persons here are practitioners. And so I want to speak to you from a presentation I did at 3 a.m. this morning. And the first thing I did when I came here, one of the first things is to talk to my good friend Luke here. And I said, if I'm not making any sense, Luke, what you could do is just give me the signal and I will wrap it up neatly. So Luke, I'm still holding you to that. But I feel as though the universe has brought all of us together in this discussion, because what I'm hearing are so many persons also discussing the things that I thought I needed to discuss, and the imperatives for social work and social work education. And as I present, you too will understand just how the universe has perhaps brought all of us into this space. And I want to recognize that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I first want to recognize my mother, Oma Boodram, who, if she knows me mentioning her name, will probably want to strangle me. But from whom, as a little girl, I saw kindness and humanity, and really the pursuit of helping people, not just helping people in a superficial way, but in a way that promoted their human worth and dignity. And I stand on other giants. I stand on persons like you. Many of you know that I'm the practicum coordinator at the university, and I've served in that position for a few years now. And our students are the ones that are nurtured by you. And so I'm standing on your shoulders as well, standing on you as giants in social work, and I recognize that. And so my presentation initially was social work education for the future world. And I've given it a subtitle, Growing, Thriving, and Leading. And I want to talk a little bit about growing the profession. Social work educators now are required to do things differently, to step aside from a very managerial approach to social work, to step aside from something that may be wrapped within systemic issues that may act as barriers and challenges to our delivery, but to grow a profession that is reflective of all of us. When I read my students' practicum reports, when I engage with them in talking about theory and how it's reflected in practice, I get some students that are confused. As a student myself, and more so as an educator, I look at the theories that we use, and I don't see myself reflected in many of those. And I look to the person to the left of me, to the right of me, and I perhaps don't necessarily see those persons as also being reflected in what we do. We come from using very westernized models, models that perhaps do not integrate our sources of knowledge. We need to grow the profession so that the profession looks like us. And it doesn't look different from even the people that we serve. And so education, social work education for the future, needs to be reminded that we need to be inclusive and provide access to those persons who themselves we have called vulnerable, who themselves are at risk. And you know that adage, for us, by us, that comes to mind all the time, that social work education is supposed to provide access to those persons who have experienced some form of social, some issue, to also come into the profession, and for the profession to grow and be inclusive. And I'm also talking about a gender disparity that we might be seeing, where if you look in this room right now, we see that there is an imbalance, a disparity in the persons that are providing service. And there is nothing wrong with it, of course, with more women providing service. But our profession has to be very inclusive to also be able to attract men. Yes. Men. Yes. And I'm saying that because of what our students talk about, of how sometimes we need men or male social workers to reach young male clients. So we need to be inclusive and encourage respect into the profession that will allow for that, and many others. And so we need to grow the profession. We need to have the profession thrive. So beyond providing access, in terms of social work education, we also need to recognize the need for social work to thrive in the communities, in the social work, what I call the social work industry of Trinidad and Tobago, and thrive in a way that there is continual professional development and a focus on continuing professional development of social workers. And that means that as social workers, we have to understand the importance of lifelong learning. Social work in a future world requires us to focus on lifelong learning and continuously work towards lifelong learning. And then leading. And I want to stay a little while in leading to talk about social work education for a future world. And I thought that instead of doing this massive PowerPoint, my first one was about 20 slides. I said, oh God, no, people will feel in class again. So cut it down, Sherry, cut it down. So I cut it down to 10, and then, well, I just have 5 key points now that I want to talk about. The first one, and I'll talk about it again, legitimizing Caribbean knowledge and practices in social work. I hear Mr. Benjamin talk about the disconnect between theory and practice. We've engaged in those conversations. We have engaged in those conversations. And why is there that disconnect and that disparity? We have not legitimized Caribbean knowledge and Caribbean practices, our culture, in our social work practice. And that, I think, is where some of the disconnect emerges, in that legitimizing. We have not valued what our experiences are as social workers. We have not valued that. And so when I engage with social work students, and I engage with you all as practice teachers for our students, I hear that. And I hear almost as if we're covering down that indigenous knowledge that we have, those experiences, and trying to jigsaw puzzle it into a world of Western knowledge and Western practice. But you know what? Those Westernized theories perhaps does not necessarily apply to us in totality, because the experience in the global North is different from the global South. And so we have to make this legitimizing one of our key priorities as we move forward. A commitment to social justice was the second point. There is a need for us to re-examine issues of justice and social justice and fairness for all, of wealth going to particular groups of persons, and for us to address growing disparities that have been emerging. When we look at, when we have a commitment to social justice and social justice ideals, then it means that we are also supposed to look inward. We need to look inward, because there are some systems or systemic barriers or structural barriers which exist even in when we deliver services to our clients. And I call it the parking lot phenomenon. I tell my students that don't go out there, and recreate this parking lot phenomenon. You'll before COVID-19, of course. You ever tried to go to a mall around Christmas time? Everybody knows every year there's no parking space, and you drive around and around and around. It's like sometimes driving around, if anybody is a student and trying to get a park at 4 o'clock. We drive around and around. But we have a parking lot phenomenon where we feel, and it's like employment, we could take any issue. We want to increase employment for young people. And if a parking lot can accommodate 100 people, we have 100 people. And our programs and our services only accommodate 100 people because of limited resources. So what we do is we shift around the cars. But guess what? It's still only 100 people that are there. So that's the systemic barriers that I talk about, and we need to look at that. We need to look inward, because that is very much tied with our commitment to social justice. And it means, therefore, that as social workers, we need to understand that we are reinforcing unfair practices with our clients. And I pause there because I want you to if there's one thing you can take that into your practice. Because in social work education and preparing students for the future, we need to have them reflect on how they may be reinforcing unfair practices to the clients that they have, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Because we've taken for granted so many things, and we have taken for granted knowledge that we sometimes assume that this is how it's always been, and it's how it's going to continue. Addressing growing disparities is also one of the things I had put up, and it's so good that Josanne talked about it. Because right now at the social work unit level, we've all united to do research. We're conducting research on how the pandemic has vulnerabilized persons who previously not deemed to be at risk. And guess what? Many of us in this room may have been part of that. As social workers, you probably would have had to leave your children at home and go out to see your clients. But your children too needed to be supervised through online learning and through other virtual platforms. You probably would have also had persons that were affected by COVID-19, loss of family members. You deal with your own grief and trauma. And so I do agree, and we are in the process of identifying communities of persons that may not have been viewed as vulnerable before the pandemic, that have been placed or pushed in a position of vulnerability, not forgetting those persons who are already in those cracks. It's just that those crevices that we had before has become cracks, and the problems have been intensified. I also want to talk about digitizing social work education and digitizing social services. But we need, as social work educators, to prepare our students for that. But remember also that we must be cognizant of digital poverty, which still exists. So we cannot be talking about digitizing of services, and still there are so many people that do not have access through digital poverty. Social innovation, and that's the next point that I wanted to raise. Social innovation. When we talk about innovation, we talk about maybe the steel pan being innovative, technology, we talk about technology, we talk about WhatsApp, we talk about computer systems. But there is something called social innovation that we as social work educators are now trying to prepare our students for, to deal with what we call complex issues or wicked problems that have multiple textures or sources, and that are experienced by multiple different segments in the community. And finally, impactful research, to reject taken for granted knowledge. And you know, a lot of people say that the university is an ivory tower with persons that are there that are so disconnected from reality. At UWI St. Augustine, the practicum has moved into creating a community project in one of our fence line communities where our social work students use that as their practicum experience. And that experience has shown us, that project has shown us the need for us to get greater involvement into communities and to also have impactful research. And that is research that is privileged by the people. It's not about social work education asking the questions we want to ask anymore, but really engaging with communities so that they could tell us what questions we should be asking. And on that note, I have engaged on a personal level, and when I say personal level as a social work educator, understanding how perhaps Caribbean social work students and my students and you as practice teachers and agencies are finding some challenges. And I want to leave with one thing that I'm working on, and it's really called the Kayapa social work. I know Verna talks about a social work, a Caribbean social work model. Or, sorry, you're talking about your model. And I'm also going to say that this is perhaps a perspective that we can use for us, by us. So the word Kayapa, and we in Trinidad and Tobago use the word Gayap, is derived from the indigenous Cariña people. It's a term which describes the tradition of people getting together to complete a huge task, build a building, or a structure, or planting and reaping. And usually after that, there's some drumming and celebration. People make a little pilau, they cook and they exchange. And I call this social work perspective Kayapa social work because I've engaged with practice teachers, I've engaged with social work educators, and I've engaged with our students. And I recognize that this can be a reflective perspective of who we are. And so it's a commitment to those who are most marginalized and vulnerable. And it is rich in cultural heritage, in the arts, the drumming, and so on, but also about it privileges things like ethnomedicines. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have heard quite a bit about how persons have used home remedies and traditional remedies to help address some of their issues in building immunity and even in having an impact on their own experiences with COVID-19. And the practice is based on Caribbean shared values of community, of value for our environment. We're co-building a new eco-world, and so this eco-world has to be very much concerned with our environment, of the values of humanity and kindness, and the vigorous pursuit of social work's highest ideals of social structural issues of values such as social justice and human rights. And with that, I want to end my presentation and thank you, because and end by saying, we say that the time is right for social work, but the time has always been right for social work. Social work has always emerged in times of crisis. But the time is right now for us to be represented as Caribbean social workers on the global discussion of social work education, of theories, practice, and paradigms, which turn in, again, dovetail nicely into your discussion of paradigm shift. And so the call to action for us as social work educators would be to develop meaningful research that impacts on communities where they tell us what we need to study. And it is for us to see ourselves reflected in the practice and our clients reflected in the perspectives that we use, and for us to move together towards this GAIAP social work practice. Thank you.
That was a very, very rich presentation, Dr. Boodram. And I am sure that a lot of our people online, and certainly even the participants in terms of what is considered the traditional community of social workers. And for somebody who is a non-social worker in the formal sense, I was really drawn to the idea of positing the importance of the Caribbean experience and our notions of how we, even by dint of what we're learning and teaching and learning, we are probably reinforcing unfair biases and prejudices that continue to undermine our sense of self. This, Minister, this is a great project to champion, I think, with the Ministry of Education, where we're seeing so much in terms of violence in schools, a lot of dislocation, a lot of school communities where they're coming from distressed families and families that are under. I mean, my mind was just going at a mile a minute. I think that there's some great synergies here, and it allows us to kind of break down the notion, sometimes justified, about the ivory tower kind of image that we have of the university, and it not being at the center of social and cultural development. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm sure we're going to get some very good feedback on that. So very quickly now, Anthony, Sule, yeah. Your turn. You're coming up here, or you're going to...
I will trump and follow suit.
Trump and follow. He playing all fours, which I love, by the way. Okay, trump and follow suit.
I shall trump and follow suit. Let me start by saying good morning, and all protocols observed. Minister, thank you all very much, particularly Ministry of Social Development, for inviting me. I have mentioned previously, and I'll repeat that I do feel like the least of the apostles upon this on this presentation stage. Yeah, the least of the apostles, and coming after those presenters and kind of information, the kind of charisma, and so on, is a daunting task, right? But I do feel honored and privileged to be here amongst the panel, and I will do my utmost to represent. Let me start with a story. My first, well, it wasn't my first, but it was my first official job. I was applying to be a social worker. My first official job. Before that, I was a social worker intern, more or less, but I was applying to be a social worker, first official job. And I sat before the interview panel, and there were two gentlemen sitting on the opposite side of the desk, and a lady. And the interview was going quite well. I can orate pretty okay, so I was doing well in my interview. And then I got a question that came from left field. Now, I will not call the name of the person because the person, the gentleman is quite well known, I would believe. He was a quite well-known gentleman. And he asked us a question that sent me for a loop. There was no way to prepare for this question. And the question was a simple one. He asked, if we hired you, how would we be certain that you would not interfere with the young ladies and the people's girl children? How do you prepare for that? How do you prepare for that question? Because in my mind, there were several females who would have come before me who most likely would not have been asked that question. So it didn't matter if I asked them what questions they got. So that question sent me for a loop. To cut things short, I did eventually get the job and I answered the question quite well. At least I think so. Because I would have indicated to the gentleman I was raised by my grandmother. I grew up with my grandmother, and she would roll in her grave if ever, any sort of conversation amongst the like would have come to bear with me and anybody's girl child or any client. As a matter of fact, it didn't have to be a girl child. It could have been an adult. And I explained to him that my ethics of my profession will never allow such a thing. For us to have this conversation about gender in social work, we first must have the uncomfortable conversation about what is gender. And so because I sit here, not with the layman, or not with clients, but I sit with colleagues, I throw it out to you, what is gender? Let us get a running definition, so that when we proceed with an understanding of what gender is. So, to the faces that stare at me, I stare back at you, and I ask, what is gender? Let's just come up with a definition. Anyone? Someone? When you hear the word gender, what comes to mind? Silence? Now, I'm hearing several murmurs, several statements, roles assigned by society, male and female. I'm hearing various murmurs. Orientation. Now, you see, one of the issues I think that we have is that when we have the conversation about gender, we don't all come on the same page. So that to start having this conversation, we kind of all have to start at the beginning of the book. We have to start at the same page. So for the sake of this conversation, I will define gender as a social construct that categorizes man and woman, boy and girl, within a given society. Can we agree to that? And we have to bear in mind that we're talking about the in the given society part of it is important because each society may decide what their gender structure looks like and the gender norms and so on and that sort of thing. Yes? Good. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have to be real with ourselves and I'm taking a page out of Miss Verna St. Rose's page, her book. I've told her already that she is a role model of mine. And we'll have to speak plainly when we're having this conversation. So that in Trinidad and Tobago, let us be real, to some extent, gender is still a major determinant for many things. And so, I will maybe touch on some of these things, but I would want to get examples from you all. So when you hear me touch on a topic, feel free to think of an example, and I will come over to you. One such thing, when we talk about gender and a disparity and a bias, is about social expectations and obligations. True or false? So when we talk about a disparity and a bias in social obligations and expectations, give me one such example. Anyone? No? Can't think of a single social expectation or bias that is gender fueled? Men must not cry. Isn't that a bias? Is that gender fueled bias and an expectation of society? Let me bring it to a humorous extent. Nobody ever asked me if I afraid cockroach. Nobody never asked me if I afraid to pick up dead rat. Yeah. However, the expectation is I have to man up. Cockroach in the house, I have to go and kill it. Snake creep in the house, I have to take it out. But what if I afraid snake? What about the biases in social relations and relationships? Are there gender biases in social relations and relationships? Yes, of course. Give me an example. Correct. So we're saying it's a good bias that men are expected always in a relationship to go and pay for the date. But give me another example, guys, of a bias in a relationship. All women must know how to cook. What kind of wife you gonna make if you can't cook? What? What? Oh my gosh. Well, I'll come to that. So let's tackle this one. That women must know their place. Now, I feel as though I'm in the wrong place to have this conversation. Yeah? So men must know that is a relationship bias that we do have. What was the point you brought up, sir? That a man cannot be a victim of abuse, and I'm guessing in a relationship. And those are biases that we hold. Those are gender biases that we hold for relationships. There are also biases that function within the household. There are gender biases that function in the household. Give me a gender bias in the household. Pardon? So a man should not or cannot be a house husband. The man's role and responsibility is to go out and work. Can't stay home and watch Young and Restless and cook. Nah, man. Yeah, no. So what about this continuous expectation that where we continue to ascribe gender roles to the household, where men must do certain things in the house and women do certain things in the house? How correct? So how the household chores are assigned? Should that be based on gender, or should that just be based on personalities and disposition? What are you good at? And so when we start having this conversation and we start delving into the everyday functionings, we recognize that deep within our societal functioning, there are gender-based biases. Now, I know this may be a sore point and persons may tend to disagree, but to a lesser extent, professions in Trinidad. Are professions in Trinidad still bounded by gender biases? And before you answer that question, just take a look around. Just take a look around. Because despite the efforts of Dr. Boodram and persons of the ilk, there's still a perception that social work is a female profession. Is helping people, is caring, and so on, and that is not for men. Women are helpers, nurturers. They're born for that. Man is to go out and turn brick and stone and mix mortar. So even within our professions, there are gender-based biases. So that within, permeating throughout the entire society, within all of the institutions, we have some gender-based biases. Gender still determines, to a great extent, a person's overall well-being in terms of access and control over resources and opportunities. True or false? It's the truth. And it is something that must stay foremost in our minds as practitioners. We must be aware not only of the societal biases, but of our own biases as well. As a young man attending an all-boys school, there was a cultural practice for us to consider anything that was not extremely masculine as gay. So if you weren't extremely masculine, if you were into your attire a lot or whatever, everything that was not extremely masculine, and of course by masculine I mean here rough and rugged and untidy. So anything that was not that was categorized as gay. And I remember first entering into school, the tertiary education, and thinking to myself, and to a lecturer I believe I spoke to as well, and I said, listen, sir, I don't know how I'm going to handle somebody or work with somebody who has a difference in sexual orientation or representation in gender and so on. I don't know. That's not how I grew up. That's not what I know. I don't like it. And fortunately for me, I have lived long enough in the field to have had that ignorance wiped. We have to be cognizant of our biases. What worked well for me is that I was aware of my bias. And because I was aware of it, I exposed myself and I worked on that. And changing that bias has made me better for it. Now, as I mentioned previously, we need to be cognizant of the many biases that we have on stereotypes, because, you know, in Trinidad and Tobago, we like to stereotype everything and everybody. Everything must fit neatly into a box that we can check, else it's not making sense. I iterate, we need to examine what are our biases, what biases we have on gender, and how will that impact upon our practice. In her research on social work and gender-based and gender biases, Yaroshenko identified the correlation between the low level of gender competence of social workers, practitioners, the challenges for gender education of social workers, and the gender-sensitive social work practice within a country. All of that simply to say, if they don't educate you about your gender bias, if they don't have education programs that teach you how to control and deal with those gender biases, what's going to happen is your general practice as a social worker is going to be impacted significantly by those biases. Doesn't that just make sense? So then I have to reiterate again that we need to be cognizant of the biases that we hold. With? I realized one more time, I'm going already? All right. Now, I'll fast track and say this. It is therefore imperative for social work and the social services community to continue pushing for a more gender-sensitive based education and training facility. We must push education, gender education and gender bias-based functioning, and that must happen at all levels of social work functioning. And in closing, I will leave you with the words of John F. Kennedy. One person can make a difference, and everyone must try. I thank you. I thank you. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sule.